Welcome to Gospel Lil Prep. I am Avery.
It is vital, therefore, that we understand our history to guide us to make the right choices in the future.
Slavery, a scar that spans the entirety of human civilization. Nearly every known culture and region has borne its mark. Although modern criminal laws worldwide now condemn slavery, in 2021, 50 million people remained trapped in modern forms of enslavement. Vulnerable individuals, from trafficked women and children to exploited laborers, are still denied freedom and basic human rights. For secular liberals, slavery's existence contradicts the Enlightenment-born belief in human dignity. Yet each case of modern slavery today undercuts the narrative of progress, serving as justification for liberals condemning some country or ethnic group, rather than inspiring rescue efforts. Just as the French Revolution once lifted banners of liberty, equality, and fraternity while filling countless guillotines, humanity continues this moral paradox. So, is it truly humanity's own reason that ended slavery? When human reason was first highly praised in ancient Greece, philosophers like Aristotle defended slavery as natural, beneficial, and just. Plato called it a necessary part of an ideal society. When reason was once again exalted, rationalists critiqued slavery not out of compassion, but out of utilitarian concerns. When Enlightenment thinkers saw Adam and Eve as a myth and denied a shared human origin, they inevitably started to view black people as fundamentally other and support racial theories. Voltaire argued that black people were naturally inferior. Kant famously dismissed a black carpenter's thoughts as stupid, and David Hume, in a notorious footnote, wrote that he suspected non-whites to be inherently inferior. Respect for diversity becomes hollow and hypocritical. Clearly, challenging the deeply rooted slavery was almost impossible. In truth, another great movement that has influenced the world for centuries, the Christian Evangelical Revival, has been largely ignored by the general public. From petitioning parliamentarians to kneeling intercessors, from Moravian brethren heading to colonies, to missionaries who willingly shared the plight of enslaved African brothers, British and American evangelicals fought for the biblical ideals of equality in creation and brotherly love, striving to bring God's will on earth as it is in heaven. William Wilberforce, a leading abolitionist and Puritan statesman, famously argued that a society grounded in Christian values, led by individuals with deep Christian commitment, was key to maintaining moral and political integrity. Today, as Western civilization faces yet another critical choice, politicians skilled in divisive rhetoric continue to fan the flames of identity politics. Meanwhile, devout Christians once again turn to prayer, urging people to submit to Christ, reflecting on that flicker of faith that once illuminated political history might be more timely than ever. In the 1st century AD, a runaway slave named Onesimus embarked on a journey to return to his master, risking the death penalty. His master Philemon was a wealthy Christian. After fleeing from Philemon's household, Onesimus went to the Apostle Paul in prison, where he converted to Christianity. Paul urged Onesimus to return and wrote a letter requesting Philemon to accept Onesimus back as a brother in Christ. In Roman society at that time, runaway slaves could face death penalty. Onesimus set off, clutching this letter, like a madman in the eyes of the world, believing that his master waiting far away had become a brother to him in spirit. This was the beginning of the abolition movement of humanity. In the Bible, Paul's teachings to Philemon and the Galatians illustrate an opposition to slavery. Shortly after, numerous actions emerged within the early church that were inherently incompatible with slavery. Against a backdrop of ancient societies where slavery was culturally ingrained for centuries, Christians interacted with slaves as they would with free individuals, taking communion together at the same altar. Since the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians actively pursued the redemption, freedom, and upliftment of enslaved individuals. Saint Melania freed 8,000 slaves. Saint Ovidius, a wealthy martyr, freed 5,000. Chromatius freed 1,400. Eventually, Emperor Justinian rose to power, abolishing laws that restricted the liberation of slaves. This political shift aligned with the views of prominent theologians. In the early 4th century, Lactantius declared in his Divine Institutes that in the eyes of God, there were no slaves. St. Augustine, in The City of God, identified slavery as a consequence of sin, counter to God's divine plan. St. John Chrysostom declared, "In Jesus Christ there are no slaves, therefore there is no need to own slaves." As a result, Christianity's recognition, respect, and release of slaves led to large numbers converting to the faith. In the 3rd century, St. Calixtus, once a slave himself, became a bishop and later celebrated as one of the early popes of the Roman Catholic Church. By the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian honored a 4th century Christian slave martyr, by dedicating the Grand Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna in his memory. Throughout these centuries, figures like Saint Zodicus in Constantinople risked their lives to care for the vulnerable and outcast, while Gothic slaves like Euphemia maintained their Christian faith under severe persecution. Others, such as Genesius of Rome, embraced Christianity with remarkable devotion. Freeing slaves requires not only Christian compassion, but also courage. Some monastic orders committed to ransoming Christian slaves from the Moors, an effort that continued for centuries. Monastic orders like the Mercedarians and the Order of St. John of Matha formed with the express purpose of ransoming enslaved Christians in North Africa, sometimes even offering themselves in exchange for others' freedom. As the gospel spread, these early abolitionist efforts gained traction, leading to a steady decline in the institution of slavery. By 1102, the Synod of Westminster declared slavery and slave trading illegal. By the 14th century, long before the Enlightenment, slavery had become extinct in continental Europe and England. The colonization of Africa in the 16th century brought a resurgence of slavery, but where sin flourishes, the gospel goes. After Martin Luther's Reformation in 1517, a counter-Reformation movement emerged within the Catholic Church, leading to its moral and spiritual renewal. This period saw the rising of the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. At the time, most Protestant nations were located in northern and central Europe, still in a defensive position. As the surrounding Catholic maritime nations like Spain and Portugal expanded globally, the Jesuits' order became the primary force in the initial global missionary wave. Missionary figures like Peter Claver emerged, known for his dedicated ministry to enslaved Africans. Claver later became recognized by the Catholic Church as the patron saint of slaves, Columbia, and ministry to African Americans. But who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? A century before Martin Luther ignited the Reformation in Europe, Jan Hus, as the first martyr of this cause, sparked the Hussite movement in early 15th century Bohemia, now the Czech Republic. This movement eventually led to the formation of the Moravian Church, considered among the earliest Protestant communities. After enduring years of exile and persecution, the Moravians found a new foothold in 1722. At a time when Protestant Britain had risen to global prominence, a group of Moravians settled in eastern Saxony, Germany, where they established the village of Herrnhut. In 1731, an African named Anton, formerly enslaved in St. Thomas in the West Indies, visited Herrnhut, informing them about the enslaved Africans' harsh lives. Two members, Leonhard Dober, a potter, and David Nitschmann, a carpenter, felt they should go to the Caribbean islands and tell the slaves about their savior. Their plan initially met with strong opposition from court official in Copenhagen. When asked how they would support themselves, Nitschmann replied, "We shall work as slaves among the slaves." "But," said the official, "that is impossible. It will not be allowed. No white man ever works as a slave." "Very well," replied Nitschmann. "I am a carpenter, and will ply my trade." In 1732, they reached the Caribbean and began their mission. Over the next 20 years, the Moravian Brethren expanded their efforts worldwide, with a profound sense of mission to evangelize black slaves. Some Moravians even sold themselves into slavery, voluntarily entering the brutal world of plantations to bring the Christian gospel to Africans. These bold actions sparked a spiritual revival among black slaves, abolishing the slave in human hearts even before slavery itself was legally abolished. Across the ocean, this small church also inspired the Piety movement and the Evangelical revival among the Puritans in Britain and America. John Wesley was one of the early leaders of the British Evangelical revival movement. In 1735, he traveled to America for missionary work and encountered Moravian believers on a ship, deeply impressed by their devoutness and courage. After a disappointing return in 1737, Wesley met Peter Baylor, a Moravian preacher, and realized the shallowness of his faith. In 1738, Wesley attended a Moravian meeting where someone read Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. Struck by the message, he experienced forgiveness and rebirth through God's word. From then on, Wesley began to preach to the lower classes, leading many workers, farmers, and slaves to commit to the Christian faith that was being forsaken by society. Christianity saw its first post-Enlightenment revival.
Amazing grace, how sweet Piema. Giko. Giko.
In Britain, evangelical influence within the established church led to the formation of the Low Church, a term that was initially pejorative. In 1785, William Wilberforce, then the youngest member of the British House of Commons at age 24, was influenced by the evangelical revival and converted to a devout Christian. At that time, religious enthusiasm was often ridiculed by the upper classes. Wilberforce questioned whether he should continue in politics. He attended various churches in London seeking answers until he met John Newton, a former slave trader turned evangelical pastor, who had written numerous hymns after his conversion, such as the most famous one, Amazing Grace. One night, Wilberforce visited Newton to share his struggles and pray together. Newton saw that God was leading this young man down an untraveled path and encouraged him not to withdraw from Parliament, praying for him. "I hope and believe that the Lord Jesus has raised you up for the benefit of his church and our nation." This prayer set the course for Wilberforce's life, turning politics into his monastery. Influenced by his faith, he developed a strong interest in humanitarian reform. At that time, he was virtually the only member of Parliament who believed in the Trinity God, and regarded as a Don Quixote who naively attempted to challenge the British Empire with outdated religious doctrines. But Wilberforce was not alone. As he became a member of Parliament, the Quakers established the Anti-Slavery Committee and submitted the first petition to Parliament in 1783. They recognized the need to exert influence within Parliament and urged Thomas Clarkson to secure a commitment from Wilberforce to advocate for abolition in the House of Commons. In 1787, Wilberforce decided to bring it forward.
I present my bill.
At this time, some Christians began coming to his residence to discuss the slave trade abolition bill. They formed a prayer group that evolved into the famous Clapham Sect. Wilberforce and his brethren resolved to dedicate their mouths in Parliament, dedicate their knees on the prayer mats at home, standing in the unseen breach of this nation. Wesley had also prayed for these young politicians. "May your rise serve as the testimony for God's will to be done in Parliament, as it is done in heaven." The 8 Christians of the first generation of the Clapham Sect devoted their lives and moral example to persistently propose abolition bills. Their perseverance stemmed from faith in an absolute standard of good and evil. As Wilberforce said, "Whether it is God's will does not depend on whether the bill passes, but whether the motives and essence of proposing this bill align with the Scriptures. If it does, even without fulfillment of results, it is still God's will." The efforts of the Clapham sect were not limited to proposing bills in Parliament year after year, giving speeches, and praying through the night. They strategically divided the liberation of black slaves into 2 phases. First, the abolition of the trade that viewed slaves as animals, and then the system that treated slaves as property through redemption. One member, Thomas Clarkson, a renowned writer, greatly influenced the abolition movement with his works. After reading his writings, Tsar Alexander I resolved to join the abolitionist movement. Members who were merchants, financiers, and educators emphasized trade and education in their abolition strategies. By developing trade, they aimed to weaken the market demand for black slaves, while education sought to elevate the perceived value of black individuals. In 1790, the Clapham sect purchased Sierra Leone in West Africa and sent around 2,000 liberated slaves there, establishing a city without slaves, supporting free labor among blacks, and engaging in equitable trade with Britain. This city later became the Republic of Sierra Leone, with its capital named Freetown. By the late 18th century, after successfully advocating for legislation that allowed missionaries to spread the gospel in the colonies, various Protestant churches, including Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, began evangelizing in these regions, leading many slaves to Christianity. In 1797, Wilberforce published A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians, which became a bestseller and was translated into 5 languages. Many parliamentarians and nobles came to believe in Jesus after reading this book. Under the influence of the British abolitionist movement and the advocacy of its Lutheran Church, Denmark abolished the slave trade in 1803. On February 23, 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. After 2 decades of continuous struggle, they finally opened the first door to freedom. The halls of Parliament erupted with thunderous cheers, and everyone rushed to embrace and celebrate with the Clapham Sect. However, they found Wilberforce kneeling in a corner of the chamber with his head down, praying in tears. Not indulging in the joy of victory, just 3 days later, they established the African Institution, a grassroots organization aimed at promoting global abolitionism. Wilberforce wrote to his good friends Monroe and President Jefferson, asking both nations to cooperate in hunting down slave ships. In 1809, the United States announced at the Anglo-American Bilateral Conference that under the Stars and Stripes, the slave trade would be prohibited. In 1814, after Britain defeated France and Napoleon abdicated, Wilberforce penned a petition, urging Britain to compel European nations to agree to abolish the slave trade at the Congress of Vienna. While the war with France had continued, Britain had been able to extend the 1807 abolition into all the colonies captured from other powers. But with the return of peace, it became necessary to replace direct British control with a new legal framework of abolition. Communities of the African Institution produced 1,370 petitions with signatures numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Every constituency in Britain, even the most remote, sent letters requesting the ban on the slave trade. Between 1/5 and 1/3 of adult men signed. In some parts of the country, women signed too. This was at a time when most men did not have the right to vote, and women were excluded entirely. The volume of petitions persuaded the British government to add international condemnation of the slave trade to the negotiating table. With British mediation, nations promised to abolish the slave trade at an appropriate time. The flaw of the declaration in this point clearly was a concession to the colonial interests of Spain, Portugal, and France, whose governments did not have the slightest interest in abandoning the lucrative trade at that time. Despite this, it was a landmark in the history of humanitarianism. The declaration provided a basis for British diplomacy to advocate for the abolition of the slave trade worldwide. Britain shifted to bilateral treaties that included mutual rights to search suspicious ships and set up mixed commissions for the abolition of the slave trade. Portugal and Spain signed in 1817, followed by the Netherlands in 1818, enabling the British Navy to enforce the international ban more effectively by the 1840s. Following 1815, many black slaves in British colonies embraced Christianity. This transformation was not sudden, but the result of missionaries suffering alongside them for years. Attacking slavery directly in areas with legal systems was difficult, and it was even harder in colonies lacking legal protections. Slaveholders viewed missionaries as threats. Missionaries caught in this predicament had to avoid discussing politics. Methodist missionaries even asserted, "We want black converts to remain loyal to their masters and submit to human authority." This stance clashed with the Clapham sect's abolitionist ideals. From 1815 to 1824, tensions escalated, culminating in the execution of the missionary John Smith in 1824 for inciting rebellion during a conflict between blacks and whites in the colonies. He said nothing in court, only reading aloud before sentencing from 2 Corinthians 4:8-9. "We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed." This event shocked the British Isles. Wilberforce publicly confessed his regret for not rescuing Reverend Smith, feeling his age. He presented his final petition to abolish slavery and announced his retirement from politics. That year, the Slave Registration Act was passed, and the Clapham sect's successors continued pushing for the Slave Emancipation Act. In 1833, just a week before William Wilberforce died, the British Parliament passed the final abolition law, declaring slavery illegal and compensating 750,000 enslaved individuals in the British Empire with £20 million at £27 per person. By 1840, slavery had ended completely in all British Empire territories. Afterward, another British missionary, David Livingstone, spent 30 years in Africa, advocating to extend the ban on the slave trade from maritime routes to the interior. In 1870, Britain compelled the Sultanate to abolish slave trade. In 1873, Britain forced the closure of the largest slave market on Africa's eastern coast. By 1879, a cathedral was erected on the ruins of this former slave market. The abolition movement in the U.S. was also greatly influenced by evangelical revivals, with about 2/3 of its leaders being evangelicals. Quakers were prominent in organizing slaves to escape north. Presbyterian and Methodist churches offered spiritual support. Evangelical author Hannah More, inspired by William Wilberforce, wrote numerous evangelical tracts that motivated many Christian women in the UK and the US to support abolition from their homes through writing. One prominent figure was Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The abolition movements in Britain and later in America were the major forces behind the modern abolition of slavery. Abolitionists' century-long efforts took place during the time when the Enlightenment and the French Revolution clashed with Christianity, pushing Europe entered a world without divine authority. Yet, at this very time, British parliamentary politics and conservatism also took shape, allowing the faltering values of the Christian tradition finally regain their footing. Christians like William Wilberforce bridged the transition from old to new, establishing the conservative qualities of Britain and America. Unlike Enlightenment thinkers and revolutionaries, they lived out what they preached. While the Enlightenment and rationalism demanded abolition in theory, slave for them is an abstract adjective, a symbol that does not correspond to a real living soul. In practice, they manifested as violent revolution and the guillotine. France never truly experienced a genuine abolitionist movement. Its abolition was subject to the pressure of the British and American abolitionist movements. It was, ironically, the despised evangelical believers, pastors, and missionaries who, driven by steadfast faith, accomplished the mission of ending slavery. In 2,000 years of history, who transformed a slave into a pope? Who turned a slave trader into a pastor? And who moved a playboy to labor for the enslaved in distant plantations for half a century? God changed sinners who received grace and, through them, changed the world. Yet His will stands above the world. It is precisely this faith in God that gives us the courage to uphold clean means and justice, and instills in us a spirit of tolerance, allowing the freedom of diversity. That's all for this episode of Lil Prep. Making a video is not easy. If you enjoyed my content, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. This is Gospel Lil Prep. I am Avery, and I'll see you in the next video.